Good evening. Good evening, dobro večer. Good evening. Dobro večer. Hello, Lithuania. Good evening. I'm not calling names. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the another lecture in a row, quality lecture in the row that we'll have tonight. We are grateful that we have here some excellent speakers, and thank you for coming and serving to us this week. Today we heard from Dr. David Van Dyke, but today we'll hear from one more David, another David. Dr. David Lauber is Dean of Humanities and Theological Studies. Did I say it right? Sometimes I struggle with those titles at the Wheaton College. He's Professor of Theology. If you see his portfolio, he taught many courses. When I see his articles and books, I say for him that he can speak plainly about theology and make theology simple, but he can speak about very deep topics and difficult topics. So today we'll hear from the topic of the patient obedience and ministry of Jesus. And we are looking forward to hear about it. Just to ask for the translation, prijevod ok, sve pod kontrolom? Yeah, ok. Ako nekome treba još prijevod, ok. Ready to go. Welcome.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you. I'm grateful for the invitation, for me to be here and my colleagues. It's also a little intimidating to stand behind this pulpit because my wife spoke so eloquently from this pulpit on Sunday, and she sang so beautifully. I will do my best. There will be no singing, but I'll do my best to speak well. So in this evening's lecture, we'll address aspects of Jesus' ministry that manifest the patience of God, that demonstrate Jesus' own patience and provide guidance for understanding patience as a characteristic of Christian discipleship. We'll treat elements of Jesus' life and ministry that demonstrate various forms of patience, including his self-giving love, his single-minded commitment to his vocation, his attentiveness to people, and his willingness to be interrupted, his manifestation of the patient love of God, which is merciful and gracious, and finally, his persistent faithfulness towards the people whom he calls. We'll cover a lot of ground. My hope is that you find something in what I have to offer that will be encouraging to you as we think about Jesus' patience, God's patience, and our own call to be patient disciples of the Lord. Since theology is done best in a posture of prayer and from a close reading of Scripture, we'll begin with prayer, move to a focused theological account of patience, and engage in a close reading, theological readings of familiar biblical texts. So let's begin with prayer. This is a prayer for Lent from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. O God, whose glory it is always to have mercy, be gracious to all who have gone astray from your ways, and bring them again with penitent hearts and steadfast faith to embrace and hold fast the unchangeable truth of your word. Jesus Christ, your Son, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, one God, forever and ever. This prayer highlights mercy as an essential attribute of God. God displays his glory by acting mercifully and graciously, and we could also say patiently and lovingly towards sinful and wayward creatures. We note as well that this prayer stresses that God's glory is always to have mercy. We can say that God's glory is always to have mercy because God does not act arbitrarily. He never arbitrarily acts mercifully from time to time at the whim of his will. No, God just is merciful. Furthermore, God has mercy on sinners and acts graciously towards those who stray from his ways with a purpose in order to rescue them, redeem them, and restore them. The prayer for sinners in this prayer, the prayer is that they return to the Lord with penitent hearts and steadfast faith. This is indeed the goal of God's patience. We read in 2 Peter 3, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." I also suggest that embracing and holding fast to Christ in steadfast faith is a fitting human response to God's love. For God abounds in steadfast love and faithfulness. So to state things plainly, God's patience is the perfection or attribute of God that is manifested in his redeeming and restorative mercy and grace. So let's talk a little bit about how patience is an essential attribute or perfection of God. In his treatment of God's perfections or attributes in Church Dogmatics, Volume 2, Swiss theologian Karl Barth begins with the basic statement that God is the one who loves in freedom. He then considers the attributes of God's love and God's freedom with three couplets, three pairs. God is gracious and holy. God is merciful and righteous. God is patient and wise. His account of patience is unmatched in modern theology, and it's his account that serves as the starting point for my reflections this evening. Early in his treatment of God's patience, at the beginning of a long exegetical section on the book of Jonah, Karl Barth provides a simple and memorable statement. He writes this: "An impatient God would in fact be a petty, human, weak, and finally false God. It is only the patient God who is the great, divine, strong, and true God." Now, these contrasts that Barth identifies that distinguish the patient God from an impatient God are very significant. So first, an impatient God is petty, while the patient God is great. To be petty is to be small-minded, spiteful, and stingy. An impatient, petty God is easily insulted and wounded. A petty God is easily offended and holds grudges. A petty God is unpredictable. People fear and resent this God because they constantly question the mood of the petty and easily offended God. Note, too, that by being easily offended and wounded, this petty God is also easily appeased through flattery and attention. Now, we all have experience with petty people. They're self-focused, easily offended, hold grudges, and are unpredictable. Yet we learn how to be around them, and we even learn how to manage them. We know that if we flatter them and feed their ego, they will be happy, at least for a while. The true God, who makes himself known to us, to the people of Israel, and in the person of Jesus, is not petty. The true God is great. And God's greatness is shown in the fact that he can handle human resistance and rebellion. Now, notice, this doesn't mean that God is unaffected by human rebellion and sin. No, God is not indifferent to this. He meets our disobedience, rebellion, and idolatry with judgment. But God is never overcome by rage. God does not hold grudges. God is quick and ready to forgive. And God cannot be manipulated by flattery and appeasement. Second, an impatient God is human, while the patient God is truly divine. I would suggest that an impatient God is a human projection, marked by human insecurity. An impatient God, like an impatient person, is desperate to prove his significance. I think that human beings are impatient often because they need to project an image of strength and importance. They need to show people their power and demonstrate their worth through control and a demand for recognition. The true God is not a projection of human insecurities or aspirations. The true God reveals himself as the humble Jesus, who lovingly gives himself for the sake of the world. Now, hear me right. God is indeed worthy of human fear, awe, reverence, and praise. For God is inherently glorious and praiseworthy. Yet we need to remember, God has no insecurities, no needs, no deficiencies. God does not prove himself by domination. God proves himself as God. How? By demonstrating his love for sinful creatures in the incarnation, the life, the death, and resurrection of the Son. Third, an impatient God is weak, while the true God is strong. An impatient, weak God seeks to exhibit strength through control by resorting to force and a reliance on violence to secure obedience and allegiance from the human creature. This impatient, weak God has a short temper and is vindictive. An impatient God acts with great bluster and relies upon threats and rage. This God is insecure and needy. As we've seen, the true God is strong and not weak. The true God is long-suffering and forbearing, slow to anger, merciful, gracious, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Now, from a sinful human perspective, these attributes, grace, mercy, patience, they're sometimes considered to be signs of passivity or weakness. Weak people are patient, right? Weak people are merciful. So-called strong people show no mercy as they dominate and defeat their opponents. These so-called strong people execute justice as vengeance and retribution. They do not extend grace. These so-called strong people act quickly and decisively. They take control and manage situations. By being quick to anger, they seek to manipulate others by making them afraid. Impatient people, it seems to me, who attempt to project an image of strength and power are in fact weak. They are weak because they tend to be so insecure, so self-preoccupied, that they lash out at others in an attempt to secure their own worth for themselves. As we've seen, God lacks nothing. The true God has no need, so God acts out of fullness. The true God is self-sufficient. Now, not in a way that leads to detachment or disinterest, but in a way that leads God to be for others without losing anything of himself. So God is patient as he gives time and space to his creatures. He guides them, he sustains them, he accompanies them, but God does not manipulate or coerce. Fourth, an impatient God is a false God. As we've seen, an impatient God is the God of human projection, a creation of our sinful, twisted minds. This false God has an insatiable lust for power. This God demands control. This God seeks to cause fear. Yet the patient God is the true God, the one who is revealed in the face of Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians 4. So note how in Matthew chapter 20, Jesus distinguishes true power from the power exercised and celebrated by the Gentiles. A very familiar passage for us. But Jesus called them to him, and he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So the way of the Gentiles is to use power to exploit and dominate the vulnerable. The way of God is to use his power to empower those whom he saves through his self-giving love. The power of control and dominance is false and no power at all. This type of power is insecure self-assertion, I would say. It's grasping after something that one does not have. It's the appearance of power that reveals this fundamental weakness. A claim to absolute power is weak and petty pretension. God is not absolute power. God is absolute love. In commenting on the confession in the Apostles' Creed of God as Almighty, theologian Benjamin Myers writes this as he contrasts Almighty with mighty. He says this: if God's power were just one power among others, if God were mighty but not almighty, then divine power would end up being another form of manipulation or control. Only a God, Myers continues, who is totally free and totally sovereign can relate to the world with total love, patience, and generosity. Moreover, God's freedom, I would say, is not sheer will or arbitrary choice. I will say something that might sound a little strange, but I'll try it out, right? God is free to be God. God is not subject to anything other than himself. God is free to be God. Now, what does that mean? God is free to act always in ways that are consistent with his character and his being. And as such, God is free to be for others, to be for us in love, patience, and generosity. We also need to recognize that God has no ulterior motive in his actions towards us. We can trust God when he acts towards us. We don't have to question, what is God really getting at when he is nice to me or extends grace to me? What does he really want? God has no ulterior motive. His love is pure and not self-seeking. His patience is true and not self-serving. His generosity is genuine and not calculating. I don't know about you, but sometimes when people are generous to me, and this is terrible, it shows my sort of cynicism, often my response is, well, okay, what do they want from me, right? They're being nice to me. Well, what do they want from me? Well, there is no ulterior motive in God. God is generous in a way that is not calculating. Ben Myers continues, and he says this: true power is the ability to love and enable without reserve. So God's power is the capacity to nourish us, to help us in our freedom to grow, right? God is for us. God empowers us. God strengthens us. There's an early church document, the letter to Diognetus, that is quite important and sheds light on what we've been talking about thus far. And so this letter answers the question, why did God send his son into the world? The answer that it gives is to hold up and identify humility. Jesus' humility, his self-giving love and service. So in response to a question, why did God send his son? The letter answers with a question. To rule as a tyrant? To inspire terror and astonishment? The answer to that question is no. No, he did not do it for that. No, God sent his son in gentleness and mildness. To be sure, as a king sending his royal son, he sent him as God. But he sent him to humanity as saving and persuading them, not as exercising force. For force is no attribute of God. Now, as we think of Jesus, gentle, mild, humble, meek, these are not roles that Jesus plays from time to time. He's not putting on a role. No, they mark his identity. And they also manifest the identity of God. I think long and hard all the time about what Jesus says. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And I think long and hard about what John writes in John chapter 1. No one has seen God, but the one who is close to the Father's heart, he has made him known. So it seems to me we need to always ask that question. Is God really like what we see in Jesus? And the answer is yes, because God is trustworthy. We can trust God's revelation. So Jesus is indeed the royal son. God is indeed the authoritative and powerful king. But what we see in the life and ministry of Jesus is that this authority and power are not exercised through tyrannical control, domination, and fear. Rather, God's true authority and power are exercised in patient, self-giving love and service, which then lead to the salvation of sinful and rebellious creatures. So we see God is not absolute power, for force is no attribute of God. God is indeed powerful, but his power is always shaped by his love. There's an American theologian who I love, and no one in this room has probably heard of, maybe Dr. Cortez. Arthur McGill is his name. No one knows him. I really like him. And he writes this about sort of the heart of Christian faith. He says, at the heart of the Christian faith in Jesus is the knowledge that true power belongs only to God. The distinctive mark of God's power is service and self-giving. And in this world, such power belongs only to him who serves. And then he makes this quite amazing statement. In the light of such a faith, the Christian has no final fear before the pretentious claims of violent power. The Christian has no final fear before the pretentious claims of violent power. Now, that might be easier said than lived, because we all experience violence and force and manipulation. So I don't want to be naive or simplistic here by saying that, but it's something we can cling to, that God is the one who is true power. Elsewhere in this early church letter to Diognetus, the author highlights God's patience by talking about how God allows his wicked and rebellious creatures to continue to exist. Right? He doesn't just wipe them out, which God, we might think God probably should have done that or could have done that. But he doesn't. Why? Because God intends to save them through the person and work of Jesus. What we need to remember again and again, and I'll say this later, I'm sure as well, we must stress that God's patience is not indulgence or indifference. God doesn't overlook our sin or indulge our sin. No, sin is serious. Evil is serious. They have serious consequences. Sin leads to death and judgment. But God is patient. He restrains himself from his justifiable anger until the time when he turns his righteous indignation upon himself on the cross. So we read in the letter to Diognetus, God did not regard us with hatred. God did not thrust us away. God did not remember our iniquity against us. But he showed great long suffering. He bore with us. He himself took on him the burden of our iniquities. He gave his own Son as a ransom for us. He gave the Holy One for transgressors, the blameless one for the wicked, the righteous one for the unrighteous, the incorruptible one for the corruptible, the immortal one for the mortal. To put it plainly, God is patient with sinners because of the saving work that he accomplishes in Jesus Christ. So we've talked about power, we've talked about love that we see in Jesus. Now we'll get more detailed into the life that Jesus lived and how his life exhibits patience. One way to talk about this is that Jesus is patient because he is constantly receptive to the Father. Right? He is constantly living a life of obedience to the Father. It is my food to do the will of the Father, Jesus says. And what does this do? It challenges, I would suggest, the world's celebration of successful people, powerful people, elite people who are self-assertive and self-promoting. Jesus is thoroughly open to the will of the Father. Jesus is uncompromisingly available to the direction of the Father. There's a Swiss Roman Catholic theologian, Hans von Balthasar, who says this about patience. He says, patience is the basic constituent of Christianity. And he defines patience this way. It's the power to wait, the power to persevere, the power to hold out, to endure to the end, to not transcend one's own limitations, to not force issues by playing the hero or the titan, but to practice the virtue that lies beyond heroism, which is the meekness of the Lamb who was led. What a lovely statement there. Who's Jesus? He's the meek Lamb who's led by the Father. So Jesus is no hero in the way that we might define heroes. No, Jesus is the obedient servant who lives according to the will of the Father, for the good of others, for the benefit of others. Now, we do need to remember that to insist that Jesus is the obedient servant who waits upon the Father, this does not suggest that Jesus is passive or ever a victim. We need to remember over and over and over again that Jesus declares, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." So to be patient is not to be passive. To be patient is to be actively obedient, responsive to the leading of God, to the call of God. We also see Jesus' patience in his single-minded commitment to his vocation as Messiah. And now we'll look, again, more closely at some specific familiar passages for us. So how does Jesus fulfill his role as Messiah? Well, we see this in Matthew's gospel. And Matthew's gospel describes Jesus as the fulfillment of messianic prophecy, right? He fulfills it in a way that runs counter to sort of how people expected the Messiah to act in those days. According to New Testament scholar Leon Morris, quote, in popular expectation, messiahs exercised authority by crushing opposition. Jesus showed his authority in his concern for the helpless and the downtrodden. In Matthew 12, Jesus is announced as the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy regarding God's servant. Quote, here is my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. So as God's servant, Jesus relies continuously on the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. He will carry out his mission to proclaim justice to the Gentiles, bring hope to the Gentiles, but he'll do so quietly, without resorting to coercion. Jesus indeed opposes evil and injustice. Jesus will indeed be victorious over evil. Jesus does bring the kingdom of God. And he'll do this, not with force or manipulation, but through his love, through his self-giving love. One notable feature of Jesus' patience is his single-minded commitment to his vocation. We could call this kind of patience perseverance. He's called by God, and he carries out this calling to the very end. And we see this in the very beginning of his ministry. Again, familiar text for us. The temptations in the wilderness. Right? The Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness, and he's tempted. One way it seems to me that we can view these temptations is that the devil is wanting Jesus to give into following a way that will lead to immediate results. Right? Turn these stones into bread. Prove yourself as the Son of God by doing this fantastic thing. Bow down to me, and I'll give you authority over all things. What is the devil tempting Jesus to do? To not walk the way of obedience that leads to the cross. He wants him to grasp after immediate results. But Jesus refuses, right? What does he do? He doesn't demonstrate his identity by a selfish use of his power, turning stones into bread. No, he endures great hunger instead of using his power in a self-serving way. He doesn't display his identity as the Son of God by presuming upon God, impatiently forcing God to prove his true identity through this fantastic display of power. No, he's committed to the way of the cross. And we know that at the foot of the cross is where we hear the centurion's declaration, truly this man was the Son of God. So his identity will ultimately be revealed. But it's in this apparent weakness and shame and failure of the cross. Jesus doesn't grasp after power and authority through an impatient and impulsive submission to the apparent power of the devil. We know how the Gospel of Matthew ends. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. So Jesus does indeed receive all authority over all things, but not through a deal that he makes with the devil, but rather by traveling the road that leads to his death. And Jesus concludes this episode in a very stark and clear way. He announces his allegiance to the rule and will of God. He is a single-minded servant of God. Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Jesus is tempted again by one of his own disciples, Peter, at Caesarea Philippi. We know the story. This is a turning point in the gospel narratives. Jesus asks the pointed question to his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter, no surprise if we know Peter, responds right off the bat, "You are the Messiah." And then Jesus starts instructing the disciples, "Okay, you're right. What is that going to look like?" Well, here's what's awaiting me: rejection, beatings, execution, but I will rise again. Peter's not thrilled about this, right? What does he do? He takes Jesus aside, thinking that he's maybe doing him a favor, right? He takes him aside and he challenges this plan. So Peter turns from the one who sees the real identity of Jesus, "You are the Messiah, you are the Christ." He turns from that to being in collaboration with the devil, just as the devil tempted Jesus to impatiently avoid a life of obedience that leads to the cross. So also Peter tempts Jesus to abandon a life of patient obedience that will lead him to rejection and isolation and death. And we know that Jesus abruptly responds to Peter's alternative plan with a stern rebuke. "Get behind me, Satan." Stunning words to a disciple, aren't they? In the US, we would say something like, "Get out of my face," right? "I don't want to see you." We could also read it as Jesus is saying, "Get behind me, because you need to follow me. I'm the one who's walking the way to Jerusalem." So Jesus is focused on his mission, and he rejects what by human standards would be the easier path, which we're always tempted with the easier path, right? What's the least amount of effort or work or suffering that I will go through? That's what we want. Jesus is willing, he's patient in accepting suffering, the suffering that awaits him. So we have Jesus exhibiting what it means to be Messiah in a way that sort of overturns the expectations of the day. We have Jesus single-mindedly committed to his vocation. We also see remarkable things in the ministry of Jesus in his attentiveness to the needs of others, especially to those who are seemingly unworthy and undeserving. This is a unique feature, I think, in Jesus' interaction with others. It displays his patience. So we can think about patience as being attentive to others, noticing others, seeing others, slowing down to meet with others. Now, in our day, at least in the US, when someone is said to be completely focused on a vocation or a goal, we think of those people as having tunnel vision pursuit of an achievement, right, of a chosen career. We think of them as refusing to allow anything or anyone to get in their way. These successful people will do anything it takes to meet the aim that they have set for themselves. And this type of behavior is often celebrated, right? How often do we hear success stories that includes descriptions like this? These people are driven, they're focused, they're highly competitive, they refuse to lose. Now, there is a way, I think, that this resolve is indeed a demonstration of patience. Someone sticking to a task, staying with the vocation, even in the face of uncompromising odds. However, in many cases, this focus, I think, is driven by self-preoccupied ambition and leads a person to ignore and ultimately resent anyone who might get in their way, anyone who might be a distraction to them, who takes up their time. We even use that language, I guard my time, I protect my time. I don't want anyone to intrude. Jesus welcomed interruptions. as he was even focused on his mission, right? He welcomed interruptions. We see it in various places. I will suggest for us that we see it starkly in the double healing story that is in the 3 synoptic gospels. Jesus heals the bleeding woman and he heals the daughter of Jairus. Very familiar to us. So he's heading to Jairus' house. Who's Jairus? He's a synagogue official. What does Jairus do? He comes to Jesus in front of him, stops him, pleads with him, come to my house to heal my daughter. She's close to death. In Matthew's account, she's already dead. And so Jesus, there's no deliberation in the narrative. It's, of course, he goes, heads off to Jairus' house, and what do we read? The crowds pressed on him, right? The crowds pressed in on him. And with this description, Mark and Luke indicate that Jesus rarely traveled unencumbered, right? There were always people who wanted something from him, right? People were desperate for his attention. What do we see with the bleeding woman? She needs healing. She trusts that Jesus is the one who will heal her. She's a part of that crowd that pressed upon him. And Jesus stops when she touches him. Seems to me that means he welcomes interruption, right? He stops and he asks, who touched me? Who is this person who touched me? Now, it would be completely understandable, and I think his disciples would have preferred if Jesus just kept going, right? You can almost picture them with bemusement, like, what are you talking about? We've got an important thing to do. We can't stop. Yet Jesus is resolved, and he stops, and he looks, and he asks. And so he gives focused attention to the woman who touched him. Now, why does he do this? I think for a few reasons. I think one reason is that there's always a connection between the healer and the one who is healed. Jesus doesn't just wave his hand and heal the crowds. No, he heals particular people of their particular ailment. And so there is a connection between him and those whom he heals. I also want to suggest that he does so for her sake, right? He has more to do with her than just heal her physically. Now, in the story, we remember that what does the bleeding woman do? She comes before him in fear and trembling, and she confesses everything that happens. This could suggest that she's worried, right? Because she knows as an unclean woman, she touches a holy man, and she's worried that she's going to be called out for that Jesus is going to rebuke her for defiling him. Another way to think about it, that why would Jesus call her out? And here I'm thinking of our today's sort of celebrity culture, a culture of self-promotion. Jesus might be thinking, well, wait a minute, I need to get credit for healing this woman. So I need to bring her in front of me so everybody knows that I have the power to heal, right? He needs public credit for that. That's not why he calls her in front of him. No, he cares about her well-being, right? The well-being of this anonymous woman. Because he calls out the woman, and he not only heals her, he commends her faith, right? Your faith has made you well. So he restores her through his touch. He also restores her through his address. Right? She has suffered physical pain. She has been on the margins because she's unclean, and now she's freed and she's made clean. When she was anonymous, she wasn't seen by the crowds. But what does Jesus do? He sees her, and he calls her by a name that marks her identity, daughter, right? So he restores her whole self. You're freed from your physical ailment, and now I'm naming you for your true identity. You are a daughter of the Lord. So what does this show about Jesus' patience? He's heading on this important task, right, to heal Jairus' daughter, but he's willing to stop. He's willing to engage with this anonymous woman. And that contrast is quite significant, right? We don't know the name of the little girl, but we know that she has status because she's Jairus' daughter. The anonymous woman has no position, yet Jesus seeks her out. Tomasz Halik comments this about this episode. He said, Jesus seeks her face, and in a way he calls her by name, thus destroying her anonymity. The disciples think this is a silly question, but because the whole crowd is pressing against him. So how can he identify the touch of a single person? But for Jesus, no one is lost in the crowd. For him, for Jesus, no person and no touch is anonymous or impersonal or interchangeable, end quote. So Jesus is patient in that he refuses to consider a crowd merely as a collection of anonymous faces or a mass of statistics of people in need. No, Jesus seeks out individuals and he ministers to their particular needs. Jesus also demonstrates his patience in his teachings. I'm looking at the time. So what do you want to hear, the prodigal son or the unmerciful servant? I was going to talk about both of those. Which one? The second one? The unmerciful servant? Oh. Okay, how about if I go very quickly through both of them, right? So we all know the parable of the prodigal son. So the translator who has my manuscript, I'm going to probably depart from it, if that's okay. And so we know the parable of the prodigal son, right? And what do we see? We see contrasts, don't we, between the patience of the father, the impatience of the younger son, and the impatience of the elder son. So the father is patient. How? He grants the request of the younger son. The younger son comes to him, asks for his part of the inheritance, and the father is patient. He willingly gives his son space and time to act on his own decisions. He allows him to go his own way, even though he knows that the consequences of his decision will be harmful to him. And the father watches the son as he departs. And so God allows us. He's not coercive, right? He allows us to wander, to go our own way. We could put it this way. He allows us to be impatient. The younger son is impatient. He didn't want to live in the household of his father in obedience. He wanted to live on his own. And the father lets him do this. But it doesn't mean that the father doesn't care for the son. Helmut Thielicke writes this. He says, the father will keep his son in his thoughts. He will wait for him. He'll never stop watching for him. Every step he takes will give him pain, for the father knows better than this son who sets out happy and lighthearted on his chosen life. But the voice of his father in his heart will follow him wherever he goes. So the father patiently allows the son to go, and he patiently waits for the son to return. The younger son is impatient. He wants his freedom, and he wants it now. We also see then this contrasting patience of the father with the impatience of the older son. So we see the father doesn't coerce the younger son to stay. He allows him to act on his own wishes, but the father never gives up on him. The son has this prepared speech when he comes back, hoping that the father would somehow let him into the household, not as a son, but as a servant. And we all know the great picture that we see, the father running to embrace his son. The father's quick willingness to restore relationship. So the son is not merely welcomed back into the household, he's welcomed back into the family. And the father celebrates, right? He celebrates the son's return. He's not reluctant in welcoming the son back. No, he's joyous in his welcoming. He doesn't see the son with disappointment and disdain. No, he receives the son with pure joy. Now, what about the elder brother? Well, the other brother is not pleased by the father's happiness, right? The brother is angry. He refuses to join in the celebration. The other brother can't even bring himself to refer to his brother as his brother. This son of yours, he says. And so he distances himself from his brother. He challenges the gracious response of the father towards the wayward son. For the elder brother, the younger son deserved judgment, not generosity, right? He deserved punishment, not celebration. The elder son is resentful. He's impatient. The father is patient and gracious. And we see this all over Scripture. The book of Jonah, the parable of the workers in the vineyard are two prominent examples. We also see it in Matthew 18, where we have Peter asking Jesus, how many times should we forgive our brothers or sisters? And we see it then that is followed by the parable of the unmerciful servant. And in both cases, it seems to me that what do we see? We see the contrast between the patient forgiveness of God in comparison with our human tendency to be record-keeping. Right? We have record-keeping relationships with others, even as we ourselves rely upon the forgiveness of God. It seems to me when we read these parables that it also shows us that we can never take God's forgiveness and patience for granted. We can't presume upon God's forgiveness, because God's forgiveness should transform us, right? It should lead us to be patient and forgiving with others. If we refuse to show mercy and grace towards others, then we don't appreciate just how much God has forgiven us, or we assume that we're worthy of forgiveness while others are not. To put it plainly, when we act in this way, we presume upon God and we take his mercy and grace and forgiveness for granted. So Peter asks, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus' response, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times, or maybe even 70 times 7. It appears that Peter considers even 7 instances of forgiveness as being extreme. He phrases it this way, as many as 7 times? He might have been expecting Jesus to say, oh no, 7? No, that's excessive. 2 or 3 is sufficient. That's all I can expect from you. But Jesus insists on the unlimited character of forgiveness. We have this interchange between a forgiven servant, right? A servant who comes to his master and is in excessive debt, pleads for patience and mercy, and is forgiven, right? The king forgives his debt. He releases him of his debt completely. God is abundant in his grace and mercy. This parable then depicts what we could call the hard-hearted demands of the forgiven servant. A fellow servant comes to him, pleads to be forgiven of a debt, and the forgiven servant refuses. He doesn't resemble the king who had forgiven him. And the king is informed about these actions. He summons the unmerciful servant in order to subject him to judgment. So that contrast, impatience of the unforgiving servant and the patience of the forgiving king. Peter asking Jesus to put a limit on the number of times he's expected to forgive another member of the church. That shows the weakness of human patience. We assume that there's a set number, there's a limit that we have. It shows accountability to this parable. We can't presume upon God's grace and mercy. We can trust God's forgiveness, and we can be grateful for his patience, but we can never take it for granted. So if we think long and hard about the forgiveness that we have received from our Lord, then we must be transformed so that we forgive others with that same abundance. Because if we refuse to do that, then I think we're taking God's forgiveness for granted. Oh yeah, God forgave me, but I can keep doing what I'm going to do. Oh, I expect God to forgive me. God's in the business of forgiving, but don't ask me to exhibit that same kind of forgiveness. One other set of passages from the Gospels, and then we'll have some time for questions and corrections if we need those. I'd like to end by talking about the resurrection appearances of Jesus, because I'd like to suggest that the patience exhibited in the ministry of Jesus continues, or it's probably better to say resumes, in his interaction with his disciples in the resurrection appearances. Now, these appearances, as we all know, follow the tremendous patience that Jesus exhibits in his passion. That we could spend all night talking about Jesus' patient endurance of his arrest and trial and beating and crucifixion and burial. And so that is, in many ways, the heart of Jesus' patience. But I want to focus on the resurrection appearances. So we have the disruptive and shattering event of Jesus' crucifixion, which is followed by the equally disruptive and shocking event of the resurrection. Jesus is victorious over sin and death. We then have these lovely stories of resurrection appearances. And I hate to say it, it's only recently that I paid close attention to what's going on in those stories. I think for years I just assumed, they're proof that Jesus rose from the dead. There's a lot in these resurrection appearance stories that we should pay attention to. Because they're a continuation, I would suggest, of Jesus' ministry after the rupture of his death, and they demonstrate his patience. Because what do they display? They display his patient and faithful commitment to those whom he calls. What does he do? He patiently pursues them. And who are them? Those who failed him, those who demonstrated faithlessness. So it's notable. And sometimes maybe we're so familiar with this that we aren't amazed every time we read it. It's notable that the resurrected Jesus chooses to appear to his disciples and calls them to be his witnesses. I don't know about you. If someone failed me so many times like that, I'd go on the lookout for other people. Yeah, I wanted you to be on my team, but it really didn't work out. I need to find other people. Well, Jesus doesn't do that. Right? His commitment to them is stronger than their failings. Because what does he do? He patiently seeks them, and he instructs them, and he commissions them. It's also notable, I think, that in patience, Jesus doesn't storm Pilate's court and gleefully display his power. Jesus does not crash through the doors of the Jewish leaders and confront them with his victory. Jesus doesn't go to the temple court with fireworks and loud music shouting smugly, "I told you so." Right? So Jesus wouldn't make a very interesting movie of this kind of victory. He doesn't go to those people. He goes to his disciples. He seeks out the very people who failed him, fled from him, and denied him. Now, this should come as no surprise because we read earlier in the Gospels that Jesus predicts the disciples' abandonment. Matthew 26, Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." So he predicts their failings. And then we have this amazing, I would say, calm and assured announcement by Jesus. "Nevertheless, after I'm raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." That beautiful nevertheless. You will fail me. Nevertheless, I will meet you in Galilee. This is patience on full display. Jesus predicts their falling. Jesus predicts Peter's denials. And yet Jesus promises to meet them after he is crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. So his calling is effective. Again, his calling is more powerful than their faithlessness, right? His calling of them is not dependent upon their faith or obedience. He's more powerful than their disobedience or faithlessness. In Matthew 28, Jesus announces, again familiar to us, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Jesus receives authority from the Father upon what? The completion of his mission. He then commissions his disciples and he charges them on the basis of his lordship and authority. "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations." So the very people who abandoned Jesus, who fled from Jesus in impatient acts of self-preservation, they're the ones who are commissioned yet again. Even though they failed him, he does not abandon them. Jesus patiently endures their abandonment, and he returns to them, to his brothers. Those are beautiful statements when he tells Mary, go tell my brothers that I will meet them. And in one text, I don't remember which gospel, it's go tell my brothers and Peter that I will meet them. Such great patience that Jesus exhibits. And then Matthew ends with this remarkable statement. "Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." So Jesus renews his commitment to his disciples. He commissions them again, and then he promises that he will be with them till the end of the age. He will patiently accompany them till the end. In John's gospel, we have the incredible encounter of the risen Jesus with Peter. And here we have a contrast again. Jesus' patience that we've seen, single-minded commitment to his vocation. Peter's impatience, right? He's double-minded. He denied Jesus in an act of impatient, hasty self-preservation. What a contrast of oppositions there. But what does Jesus do? He takes Peter aside, right? Peter took Jesus aside to say, "You're not going to go to the cross," and Jesus rebukes him. At the end of John's gospel, what does Jesus do? He takes Peter aside. And we all know the story. He questions him 3 times, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And then he commands him 3 times, "Feed my sheep, tend my lambs." Notice that address too, Simon, son of John. He calls him by the name that he first called him on those same shores. Right? He calls him again. He meets him again. And then he ends by saying, "Follow me." So the resurrected Jesus, I revises this first call of Peter. And he takes time with Peter. Why? To restore him. To restore him, to reinstate him, to recommission him. And we can see this, I think, as a fitting extension of how Jesus witnessed the third denial of him. This is from Luke. You know the story. After an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. He's looking upon him with love and compassion. And his taking him aside at the end of John's gospel is, I think, an extension of that. He loves him so much, patiently loves him. So Jesus endures Peter's denial of him. His look is a look of compassion. It's not anger or disgust. And this patient compassion continues, or it persists, when he looks upon Peter and restores him. You can imagine Peter is thinking, I am the failed disciple. Who am I? I'm the one who denied my Lord. Now, that will always be remembered. That's not erased, but it's not the final word about Peter. No, the final word about Peter is Jesus restoring him and recommissioning him to be a witness to him, to care for those who belong to him. So these encounters described in the resurrection appearances demonstrate incredible patience on the part of Jesus. He stays with them, right? He returns to them, he restores friendship with them, and he commissions them. So my aim this evening has been to suggest that we can think of patience as a significant component of the life and ministry of Jesus. And by doing that, we also, I would want to suggest, can see that when we look upon Jesus again and again, we continue to learn more and more about God's own patience, which is enacted and revealed in his life. And by doing so, looking at Jesus and looking at the patience of God, we come to see, we come to think about, we come to reflect on what should mark our lives as disciples. Those who are strengthened by the Spirit, those who are conformed to Christ, were to walk in the patient way of the Lord. Again, this is not easy, it's not simple, it's complicated, it takes discernment, but it is, I would suggest, our calling to walk in the patient way of the Lord. How about this? Let's conclude where we began with the same prayer. Perhaps we'll hear it with fresh ears after what we just heard. Let us pray. O God, whose glory it is always to have mercy, be gracious to all who have gone astray from your ways, and bring them again with penitent hearts and steadfast faith to embrace and hold fast the unchangeable truth of your word, Jesus Christ, your Son, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, one God, forever and ever. Thank you. Do you want questions? Corrections, questions? Yes.
Thank you for the lecture. The book of Job shows Job as being very patient in the quiet parts. And I think I can prove that the prologue and epilogue do not show patient Job.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems that his patience was so much that he did not let go of God until he died.
Yeah, I think I'm going to need more help from that one. I know what you're talking about, but I don't have it on the sort of tip of my mind right now. Who can help us with James referring to the patience of Job?
I think he's referring because Job did not let go of God and
Mm-hmm.
God answered. So in a sense, his impatience was patience with God.
Okay. So it could be, yeah, sort of persistence in holding on to God.
Being
Yeah.
very patient but not letting go and
Mm-hmm.
get a response from God.
So it shows a kind of faithfulness, because if we give up on God, then we hastily, we give up.
Because the other option is just not to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Dr. David, thank you for this beautiful and inspiring lecture. I'm wondering why attributes of God revealed in Jesus Christ, like patience that you spoke about this evening, doesn't have more influence in deciding and forming church leaders. And where I'm pointing to more directly is actually theological education. Because it seems to me that we are very, very skillful in reading, exegesis, knowledge in Greek, theological terms, doctrine, church history. But when it comes to reading patience, humility, slowness to anger, it's hard. So I know, in our curriculum here we have subject spiritual formation, but I don't know, can you comment?
Sure, yeah. I think some of it, and I know my own context, obviously better than this context. So I, for example, where I live in Wheaton, where many of us live, there are churches everywhere. And I've often heard even people refer to, well, how can we compete in a competitive marketplace of churches? And so then often on church boards, leadership teams, questions about efficiency, about effectiveness come into play. Also in my town, and I love my town, by the way, and the people who live in my town, there are a lot of very successful people in business and the professions. And I was going to say my fear, but I'll just say it. Here's what happens. Often they bring that mindset into the church. And so you're talking about metrics, you're talking about management of the staff, etc. And so it could be that what happens is that we don't have a theological enough account of what the pastor is to do. My wife is a pastor, and I often remind her, what are your pastoral vows? Preach, administer the sacraments. Should you read books on leadership, and should you be sort of effective in strategic planning? Yeah, absolutely. But never, ever, if that gets in the way of what you're truly called to do. And so I wonder if there's some of that. There's this sort of bleeding over of the marketplace into how churches then get structured and organized. It also could be, and here I need my friends who teach in the leadership program at my college. I also worry too sometimes that we talk about leadership often in terms of technique instead of cultivating faithful Christian leaders. It's, well, What's the sort of latest technique that can be efficient and effective? So those are some thoughts that I have. I don't serve in a church, so I don't have sort of firsthand experience as a pastor, but I've witnessed things in the church.
One question, actually. I'm thinking about Jesus in the temple.
Yep.
You know,
Yes. Indiana Jones.
I'm not sure what to think about that. And Jesus cursing the fig, especially the fig. Is that kind of impatient?
Yeah, I need help on the fig tree. I think the cleansing of the temple. So we can. Let me back up. So patience doesn't mean, again, passivity or even not exhibiting anger. But what patience, I think, means is that we're never like overcome by anger. So I think what Jesus does there is very deliberate, and it could even be kind of like prophetic street theater. Like he's he's making a really important point there, but he's not like overcome by rage. The fig tree, I'll need help from my New Testament scholars. Oh. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll need to work on that one. But the question, I think, is really important, too, because I don't want to ever give the impression that, again, somehow we can presume upon God's patience. No, we can't. And God doesn't owe us, in a way, God does not owe us that kind of patience, if you will. So we can trust God to act according to who he is, but we can't presume upon it. And some of it is how do we define terms as well. Yeah.
Thank you for lecture. I have several thoughts. I don't know, it was long day, so
Yes. Thank you for your patience to be here this late.
a long time ago I was studying a little bit about patience of God, and I found out that there are two words used in New Testament Greek. I think that one is makrotomia, something like, and hypomone, and one is related to the patience of the victor, in the sense that when you are somebody in power, but you are restraining and holding your patience. The other one is the patience of sufferer. Now, when you go to Old Testament, Yahweh God is always as a victor. This other word is never applied to this. But also, what bothered me in my search is that it is neither of these two words are never directly applied to Jesus in the Gospels. Only later in the writing. So that's one thing. Maybe you have some insight about that. And second one would be relation between God's impassibility and the patience. Impassibility meaning that he's not moved by passion, and stuff. Now, how, if this is one of the big attributes of God, in the sense that he's not he's very stable and moved, he cannot be emotionally challenged to react to certain things. In the same time, he can exhibit this patience, somehow in relation to creation. So.
Yeah, I think impassibility, simplicity are all important in articulating how God exhibits patience. How do we understand, for example, both God's love and God's wrath? Like those are real attributes of God, but they're not conflict with one another. They're not in tension or contradiction with one another. So it could be a way to say that since God is simple, impassible, then God can relate to his creation with this forbearance and long-suffering. I appreciate what you brought up about those who sort of restraining their judgment and showing mercy, and then those who endure suffering. Because this is maybe not exactly what you were getting at, but it's something that comes to mind as I think about this. I think it's people in power who really need to learn about patience in that way, of giving up their prerogatives, of giving up their control and power. And we have to be very, very careful of telling people who are in situations of suffering or oppression, oh, just be patient, because patience can be misused to keep people in positions of vulnerability and oppression. In the U.S., his name was invoked the other night, Martin Luther King Jr. Writes this amazing letter from jail in Birmingham in April of 1963. And he's being criticized by white clergy for not being patient. And he writes this beautiful response, basically saying, I've been told to be patient for so long, but now is the time to act. That's really important because he's saying people in power can't tell people who they're subjecting, oh, you just have to patiently endure this. Yet he takes up action that isn't violent. It's not sort of hasty, impatient striking back. It's very careful, in a sense, of committed to active, nonviolent resistance. And so I think that's important too. So that it raises all kinds of other questions about, patience in the midst of suffering. To what extent are there times when we have to sort of cry out and act? And that's the Psalms, isn't it? Right? How long, O Lord? And so we have if we don't have the words, the scriptures can provide words for us too, of, how long will I be in this plight, right? Will you, not hear my voice and those kinds of things. So that went a little far afield, but thank you for that. Thank you, everyone.